He's right. I am a murderer. But until 6 months ago, I was just an ordinary high school girl. Do you remember what we promised? We're not going to lose anyone else close to us again. We swore that we would always be there for each other. No matter what happens, though, I promise that I'll protect you.
If you were a boy, I might actually have fallen for you if you weren't careful.
Come on. Well, maybe I'm the one who should have a crush on you.
It was a couple years ago on a calm, cold night, maybe around early 2018, a much more relaxed time than what it is today. The rain was beating down on the sleek base of my windowsill, and there I was, cheekily sitting in my new gaming chair at the time and playing some of my favorite time killers. Some Minecraft, maybe a bit of Call of Duty BO2, sprinkled in with a bit of GTA 4. I was listening to Spotify for some music to have as ambience noise while I was calling a bunch of toddler slurs in the video game I was playing. And to be honest, I'd had enough. I was tired of losing, tired of being ridiculed, tired of the fact that I was wasting my precious time mashing buttons on a controller instead of doing something much more productive like washing my dishes or taking care of the laundry that was slowly piling up in my room. So in the heat of this revelation, I abruptly stood up from my chair and trifled out of my room. I then stripped down until I was naked, left my house without locking my front door, and stood in my front lawn, slowly rubbing my right nipple in the rain. Unfortunately, a young woman saw the actions of my clarity and proceeded to call the police, to which I was swiftly arrested and taken into custody for public indecency. Now after hearing that story, I want you to take in everything that I just said and fuck it off to the side because there's really only one important thing to take away from it. I was listening to Spotify.
Ew, yeah, boycott Spotify canceled.
Yes, I know, strange. I'm listening to music on the platform that everyone has no respect for, but for some reason still uses. Now on my average Spotify playlist at the time, it was mostly full of a bunch of Odd Future songs, some Kendrick, some Kanye, and a bunch more of the underground scene of rappers that I still tend to enjoy. However, occasionally, just like on anyone's playlist, Spotify will occasionally put new music on there that you haven't really heard. And the song that just so happened to be on my playlist was a song called Ginger Claps from this weird group I had never heard of called Machine Girl. The obscure cover art, the odd mysterious nature of the title, and the out-of-place feeling it presented really drew me in, and out of my morbid curiosity, I gave it a listen. Needless to say, I was intrigued. I had never heard anything like it in my entire life. Keep in mind that I wasn't this crazy hardcore rap and punk junkie like I am today. While I had listened and enjoyed some of that music previously, I had only really dipped my toe into the genre, and was still very much a baby boy to that whole scene of music. However, listening to this track really changed my perspective on everything I thought I enjoyed listening to. I looked up the album that the song came from, and was greeted with a whole collage of tracks, in which the titles gave very much the same vibe as the one previously. This time, while actually clicking on the page, I got a much better view of the cover art, an image of a very over-filtered wolf baring its teeth, coupled with Japanese text in the bottom right and top left. So I gave the album a listen, and then I gave the next project a listen, and then the next one, and the next one, and the next one. I was so enraptured in what was set before me that I didn't even realize I had consumed a large portion of their discography. And after doing so, I had realized that, well, I was completely hooked.
Good.
Machine Girl is a sort of punk, rock, electronic duo featuring the talents of Sean Kelly as the drummer and Matt Stephenson as the producer and vocalist. However, Matt really shines through in this duo as the main mind behind the madness. The group has a very expansive discography, currently sitting at well over a dozen projects under their belt. It's very difficult to truly encapsulate the nature of their sound, and I don't exactly have a set sound that can give a general feel for how they are. The best way I can really describe them is through Matt's words himself. Machine Girl is a sound of the apocalypse. Machine Girl started off as a solo project around 2012 to 2013, with Matt at the head of it all. The idea for starting the band came around early 2011, when the landscape of music was in the midst of a surge for sounds like contemporary R&B and the safer sounds that are more likely to create radio hits. Machine Girl's starting sounds were akin to that of a more electronic-based feel, with Matt even saying that he was going for an EDM sound at the time, and there's nothing really unusual with that. There were quite a few popular electronic groups and solo artists who incorporated electronic elements as part of their main source of sound. EDM as a genre of music was around for quite some time, and it was never seen as an underground movement for artists. In fact, many popular artists like David Guetta, Calvin Harris, and even Daft Punk broke into the mainstream at the time with a relatively electronic-based sound that reached a wide appeal to their audiences. However, there was a bit of a problem. Matt's music didn't sound anything like that. In fact, he didn't even go by Machine Girl at the time of releasing his first project. He went under the alias of Artie's Kryptonite. A unique name for a unique man, and his art would definitely show that lifestyle. Throughout his college experience, Matt and his high school buddy Sean would play for other bands at the time, seemingly fitting the mold of what a crazy punk band would be, and also getting the experience and feel for this sort of music. Matt describes that as a vibe he would usually go for, striving to have this alien sound compared to other artists. His first official project that I could date back under the Artie's Kryptonite name, besides Light Rays and Earth Days, was an EP titled Proto-voyage. Released in 2011 with a total of 9 tracks, this project is the soundtrack for a peaceful chaos. The music was so weird, and the cover art no different. But something about it had this draw, like you just can't stop listening to it. The entire thing radiates this energy of this pretty dystopia that not many other artists can do. This EP is a scatterbrained representation of my musical interests. It's bizarre, uneven, and probably slightly cheap sounding, because it is, but I still think it's a pretty good starting point. That's partially why I call it Proto-voyage. It's the very beginning of my career releasing music. This is only the tip of the iceberg of what's to come in the future. Stay tuned. That, in Matt's own words, is what this project is to him, a first stepping stone of many, in the green career ahead of him. Early on, Matt described his life as a miserable bore, living life day by day in the suburbs he lived in, and his yearn to escape that simple, boring life really shines through in his music, especially his early works. It shows a contrast for the dull, stale world he perceives versus the bright, colorful, bombastic world he strives to create. Eventually, Matt would drop Proto-voyage 2, to much the same success and sound of the noise genre he was appealing to with his previous EP. Both projects took the directionless, meandering traits of what would normally be a con for music and used it to their advantage. It's a collage of what Matt describes to represent his schizophrenic taste in music. Don't be surprised when listening if one minute you feel like you're lounging on a tropical beach of some unknown extraterrestrial ocean, and the next you're being bludgeoned to death sonically by a raging drunk dwarf. To Matt, art is chaos, and chaos is art. After the release of his first 2 projects, another smaller EP, and 2 singles, Matt would undertake the production of his debut album, which would incorporate the experience he already had making noise music, plus the influences from other music groups and internet media he enjoyed. After a couple months of silence, Matt would release the magnum opus of his Artie's Kryptonite career, Hyper Celebrity Throwdown 96. It was so odd, but had this wonderfully nostalgic sound to it, almost sounding like the soundtrack for a future-themed PS2 game. Not to mention the very obscure internet core cover art, having images from people who look to represent the feel of the new millennium, the era of the 2000s, with characters like Sam from iCarly, Tony from The Little Vampire, and Will Smith, who is still the star of his own show. Matt described his early sounds as like an old retro video game soundtrack, with games like Jet Set Radio, Akira, Ghost in the Shell, and Marvel vs. Capcom 2 being hugely influential in his craft. Several of the tracks from Throwdown 96 sound like they were heavily influenced by the Jet Set Radio OST, experimenting with other genres like a weird mix of jungle and heavier, harder bass sounds. Across the board, the feel for this new music was a new, interesting wave of experimental music for its time of release, with no mainstream artists even thinking of touching the style with a 10-foot pole. Matt's craze for weirdness set him apart from many of his contemporaries, allowing him this small cult following of skater heads and punk heads. In an interview with Revolver magazine, Matt recalls when his father would undermine his abstract ambitions, constantly asking him to seek for more accessible music endeavors, a jazz player more specifically. However, that never seemed to be his driving force of passion, having this ambition to be the flower in a field of grass.
I love like extremes and things that kind of are like overstimulating, over the top, like everything is gonna fall apart at any moment, but it doesn't.
Eventually, Matt would drop the name of Artie's Kryptonite in place of something a little more him. No worries, it's not that hard to think of a new name for your persona. Artists do it all the time, especially if they've been around for a long time. I mean, for punk groups it's easy. Just go on Google and search up a band name generator and you're good to go. Alright, maybe not. But what name would he change it to now? Artie's Kryptonite was pretty unique and suited the music. So what would be better? Directly inspired by the Japanese movie The Machine Girl, Matt would take on this new name as a representation of a new era of his career. He never exactly saw his aesthetic as a punk hardcore band, but rather saw his style more aligned with old school video games and 90s anime. And not even skipping a beat, he would release his first ever official Machine Girl single, Gravity Diva. This song was more synth-based, more melodic, but also more chaotic as well. It was released in November 2012, before the release of his final Artie's Kryptonite project, funny enough. The cover art of this single was a weirdly photoshopped version of Amy, the main character of the Machine Girl film. The art would fit the more webcore style that we see in the underground communities today, resembling stuff you would see from people like Baphomet Kun or like in Third World Elite. The track itself had a weird vibe of its own, with the musical composition giving off this fever dream feeling, and it would set the stage for the new experimentation Matt had in store, with him releasing several projects under his belt: the Girl Power EP, the Electronic Gimp Music EP, and the 13th Hour EP, with them all putting off the crazy vibe that Matt always goes for. However, in 2014, Matt would release a dual track, Emerald and Crystal Glitch Mix, and that may seem like a pretty insignificant drop, like, oh, it's just a dual track, who cares? And that's true, until you realize that it's a limited edition promo vinyl. A promo for what, you may ask? Another EP? Well, not exactly. The dual track, more specifically Crystal, was a promo for Machine Girl's breakthrough debut album, Wolf Girl. Wolf Girl was officially released on February 16th of 2014 to a much long-awaited full-length project. After all the work from his Artie's Kryptonite era, plus all the work he was releasing under his Machine Girl persona, Matt had finally dropped his real debut LP. And let me just say, this album does anything but disappoint. Every time I listen to this album, I feel like I'm injecting black tar heroin after smoking crystal meth. The album itself incorporates the sounds of noise, electro-punk, jungle, breakcore, and gives off the sort of cyberpunk vibe that Matt wants to emanate from the projects he produces. And Matt's production is nothing to scoff at. It's like a mashup of the craziest sounds you could think of, with him not shying away from compiling sounds that most artists wouldn't even attempt to mix together. The official album has a near 43-minute runtime, having 13 tracks to its name. And each and every track stretches the concept of electronic music that most people are used to. You can't take a track like Post-Rave Maximalist and really see any comparisons with many other popular groups out there, since the sounds are so alien to a lot of people. The mixing as well is not something that should be left unnoticed, with tracks like Crystal and Ionic Funk sounding like they came out of a unicorn's wet dream, especially Crystal, with the sporadic crazy drum beat comfortably clashing with the upbeat sound of the rest of the song. Listening to the album, there definitely is some influence to be heard, with albums like Detrimentalist from Venetian Snares and selected ambient works from Aphex Twin being very clear inspirations in not just Wolf Girl, but Machine Girl's sound as a whole. Matt himself even said quite a lot of his early and modern work would sound nothing like how they do if it weren't for Venetian, Aphex, and even Square Pusher, with them in particular giving off the more melodic, softer undertones that we hear in Machine Girl's work. The theme of this album runs with a sort of wolf motif, signifying the ravenous lone persona that Matt has had for his entire life. Watching many old werewolf movies as a youngster, paired along with the rabid nature of the tracks, also inspired the overall motive to roll with the style, and it continued to stick with Machine Girl all this time later, appearing in his modern albums and merchandise as well. When taking a listen to the album, you get put into a surprisingly calm intro, titled MG1, with the voice samples coming from the English dub of the Machine Girl film, and then, immediately after, you get put into the Bear's Den, where all the magic really happens. Matt continues his main theme on Wolf Girl that he's put on all of his music previously, with a sense of pure aimlessness overtaking the entire project. And that isn't exactly a bad thing. Not all music has to have this meaningful story of someone's hard, depressing life and how they overcame adversity. Sometimes you just want to make cool music that you have a passion for, and that's it. And Matt seems to have that same outlook as well, saying in interviews that there's too much pressure on artists to make their music have a clear, meaningful message behind it all. Machine Girl isn't so much a cohesive story about an artist treading along through the unfair world we call life, but rather the musical expression of a man who's faced it.
I think that within like there's the saying, kill your idols, like you have to realize that artists are people. We're not these like superhero perfect beings with like all our morals like perfectly figured out and set in stone, and we've never made mistakes. Wolf Girl's initial rollout received a good amount of success in the smaller music community, with people praising the album as the new face of electro-punk. Some of the more mainstream music crowd had a mixed bag of opinions regarding the record, calling it an aimless, noisy piece of garbage, but a lot of the underground scene found an appreciation for the ideas the album presented. And while the album didn't propel Matt to a millionaire level of success overnight, he now had more people going to his Bandcamp, more people purchasing physical copies of his work, and was now expanding his reach beyond just the average high school skaterhead. He was now getting people saying, "Oh my god, I wish I knew this music sooner," and a large group of fans asking, what's next? A lot of new listeners took note of Wolf Girl's strange musical compositions and how unbelievably foreign they sounded. I mean, it's not like it's every day you get to hear audio of fairies having an orgy party in your ears. To quote Nadine Smith's daily Bandcamp article, "Take the anger and pain of our world today, speed it up and bass boost it." That's what listening to Machine Girl feels like. So how did we get here? Well, there is quite a musical process that undergoes when making a project. Seemingly, when Matt gets asked, it comes off to me that his projects are a lot of just doing whatever he thinks will sound good. A hefty process of trial and error. He'll end up just thinking about a certain concept or musical composition that he thinks he'll like, and then he'll produce it. And if it sounds bad, he dumps it. If it sounds good, he'll keep it and evolve it into its final version. Matt describes his way of creating music as just a process of getting in the right headspace, and once he's in it, everything just ends up coming naturally. His best work is when he's in the zone, for lack of a better term. And that factor was especially amplified when the solo became a duo in 2015, once Matt ended up officially adding his longtime high school friend Sean Kelly into the mix. In a 2019 interview, the duo ended up being asked about what they would normally do when in the process of making and structuring a project. According to Sean, Matt would work on a ton of loop parts of an instrumental that he'd be working on. Once he was done, he'd send them to Sean as a selection of beats to pick from, and from there, they'd build up momentum working off of each other and make a song. It's way faster for him to just do it. I'll often listen to it and be like, maybe we should take out this part or add this. It's still like he's Machine Girl, and I'm just kind of adding to it, if you know what I mean. It would be like every morning we'd be making breakfast, talking about doing this kind of thing, or this type of groove. Sometimes I'll just describe something that I like, and he'll go make it. When asked about sampling, Matt interjects, saying most of it comes from YouTube clips of TV shows or movies, especially from some weird Adult Swim shows from back in the 2000s, or dubbed anime from around the same era.
and this work ethic would stick with them into their upcoming projects. Post-Wolf Girl, the duo would end up releasing their sophomore album Gemini in 2015, and a collaboration project with a smaller electronic artist titled Machine Girl / 5-Star Hotel, with both receiving mostly positive ratings from several music sites and fans alike. However, Matt ended up seeing Gemini as much more of a sophomore slump rather than a sophomore success, saying that the ideas he was trying to go for weren't implemented in the ways he really wanted them to. I know people think it's a good record, but it was what I was going for. After Wolf Girl, I had a really clear idea for Gemini, and it didn't turn out how I wanted it to. I was also in a weird headspace. I sort of lost it with music. I was really inside my head, lost in the sauce. Some shitty stuff was going on in my life. I personally really enjoyed the record and saw it as a major highlight in their career, but I guess every artist interprets their work differently than the listener would. I also really want to bring attention to their live shows, with a lot of people who attend describing them as some of the craziest, apocalyptic experiences of their lives. A lot of the time, Machine Girl would perform with their normal East Coast crowd from where they grew up in, normally wearing very strangely unique costumes. Matt was even quoted with saying that he purposely chose to wear very bloody, exposing, and gnarly costumes. When on stage, their performances are like a mosh pit, with Sean blasting crazily on the drums, Matt jumping into crowds, and the people jumping around and shoving into each other. The duo would also perform in the West Coast area, with LA having some of the craziest crowds, according to Matt. Throughout the next 2 years, Machine Girl would keep the steam going pretty strong, with not only the previously aforementioned albums, but also an EP and 2 more singles. However, 2017 would finally end up rolling around, and Machine Girl would end up releasing their next studio album. Because I'm Young, Arrogant, and Hate Everything You Stand For was released on December 27th of 2017, and it was their first project where they really began expanding upon just their average palette. Listeners were now hearing heavy implementations of this deep, hardcore metal sound engulfing the majority of this project, and the melding of these two genres almost seemed meant to be, with how naturally aligned they sounded. The deep mix of these spontaneous drum beats, paired along with the powerful synth and digital hardcore sound, is honestly just mesmerizing to the ears. This was also the first major project where Matt started adding his own vocals to his songs, with the writing process being reminiscent of his instrumental creation process, and the content within these lyrics is nothing short of rebellious. Tracks like Dumbass and the self-titled opening track only exemplify this idea, with the main messages being akin to that of a me versus the world kind of feeling. Although oftentimes being hard to hear due to the many layers of effects, Matt doesn't seem to skip on the lyrics at all. Other tracks, such as Machine Girl vs. Wolf Girl, have this oddly poetic structure, the vocals often blasting in your ears, yet the message being strangely depressing, creating a very interesting dichotomy of an angry hatred for the world we live in, but a sad acceptance that there's nothing we can do to make a significant change. In this track, Matt goes on to say, "An imaginary life will tear right through human flesh. I feel most real when I'm not myself. Emancipated, liberated from my human shell. Salvation in a digital heaven, 'cause real life is hell." Matt has previously elaborated in interviews that he has a very clear distinction of who he actually is versus the ideal version of himself that he portrays online. Machine Girl is Matt's vision of what he wants to be. I feel like a lot of Machine Girl is me trying to distance myself from myself. It's almost this idealized version of myself, all the weaknesses and shortcomings and insecurities I have. Machine Girl doesn't have any of those. It's a much stronger supernatural force. And the colorful, lively style that is often seen in the group's work is no accident either. Matt has gone on to say that he wants to separate the art and music he makes away from the industrial tag he's often been given, with the style and genre of industrial coming off too black and white compared to the colorful contrast that is tied with Machine Girl. And let's take a second to really pay attention to the name of the group. Machine Girl. It sounds very clearly feminine, don't you think? Well, it is, and that's because it represents the female energy that Matt wants seen in his work. Gender identity has been a very interesting subject that Matt has gone on to tackle with his art, often using his musical prowess as a way of exploring the things he's curious about. It's not something that has a super deep meaning, but gender is definitely something that I feel a little bit of fluidity with, and Machine Girl early on was definitely one way of exploring that. I think also when I was a lot younger, playing video games, I would always specifically be picking female characters and avatars. Machine Girl was almost another way of doing that, expressing myself through this female form. And the album is stylized with everything I've just listed, a sort of reservoir for the complications of the unrelenting lives we live. And no track portrays this message quite like the 12th track, Uzumaki, where the true highlight really begins. I mean, the title itself literally translates from Japanese to spiral, so you can see where I'm going with this. Everything about this song, from the instrumental all the way down to the projection of the vocals, is insane. It's meant to evoke the feeling of, as the name's translation suggests, spiraling into insanity, with the lyrics mentioning themes of drug abuse and suicide, especially in the last sector of the song, where there's a repeated chant about Matt not killing himself today. Matt has been very vocal on modern controversial issues, especially on issues regarding the music industry. He's often said that the music industry is run by power-hungry individuals who always abuse the system and the artists within it. He said that he wants the model of the music industry to be reformed, and he wants artists who are just as vocal as him to actually walk the walk when the time truly comes. However, while Matt wants it to change, he's also well aware that this false sense of hope can only do so much, and will likely be futile in the end. And while there isn't much that can be done to change anything for the better, as long as he's young and arrogant, he'll always hate everything the industry stands for. It goes without saying that Machine Girl has been influenced by many artists and groups. I already touched previously about a handful of artists who definitely had a play in what Machine Girl sounded like, but that was with their earlier work, and while it still stuck with them to a certain degree, a lot of time has passed, and time has the capability of changing a lot of things. It can change the sound of your music, and likewise, the people who influence you. This new edition of a more heavier, hardcore sound is definitely a product of that, with groups like Death Grips, Lightning Bolt, and Dillinger's Escape Plan being only some of the people to influence their more metal-based sounds. Much of the sound and style from tracks off of Bottomless Pit and No Love Deep Web can definitely be heard in Young and Arrogant, and that's inevitably so, not just with music, but with any creative process in general. When you get influenced by someone else's work, you tend to unintentionally regurgitate what you see and hear onto your present work, and once you start climbing up the ladder, other people will start to get influenced by you. This is especially true for newer artists in the realm, such as Sewer Slut and 100 Gex, only some of many people who have taken inspiration from Machine Girl's heavy, sporadic, digital core that they often tend to put in their work. With every following project, Machine Girl would start to experiment with new things, and evolve their already existing sounds to be more of their own. Earlier on, they emanated their influences and people who inspired them to even start creating music in the first place. And now, they were making themselves very well known to have incredible ideas to be brought to the table. And this outlook would follow them with their continued workload, with them releasing an in-between mixtape titled MRK 90 Mix Volume 1. Matt's musical prowess and ideas were at an all-time high, and his drive to implement them into music were even greater. And this would show with the group's upcoming 4th album, The Ugly Art. The Ugly Art is what many people seem to label as the magnum opus of Machine Girl's career. Its overall execution, paired along with the concepts and ideas it presents, is beyond monumental for the duo's sound, and it serves as what Matt originally wanted his previous projects to be. In Matt's eyes, this album is his vision of his perfect musical dystopia. I feel like it's taken me through Gemini, and because I'm young, arrogant, and hate everything you stand for, to fully get out of the slump. The Ugly Art feels like what I meant to make, and I'm happy about that. This album builds off the extreme level of experimentation that was explored in their previous album, and if you've heard the album for yourself, I'm sure you understand where I'm coming from. All of the digital hardcore elements, the heavy metal, and the cyberpunk aesthetic is far more improved upon, and I'd say even perfected on this LP. The opening track, This Is Your Face on Dogs, has this initial lead-in of a drum beat, and then abruptly jumps into the madness after a short couple of lyrics. Matt seems to maintain this level of lyrical intricacy, with several of the lines in this song alluding to madness being the way of the future, and that fear will encompass the people against his causes. And the production on this album only amplifies the lyrics, matching its very angry, chaotic manner of expression. This is especially true for tracks like Kill Screen, where Matt delves into very hot-button issues with a combination of a relatively upbeat synthetic melody along with a much harder digital melody. The themes of the song itself show Matt's feelings of antagonism towards the world, where he feels like he's fighting for justice in a dark environment, and that there's no time for rest when fighting the wicked. And this has mirrored Matt's outlook throughout the course of his career. The fight for justice alone is near impossible to win, and so it's detrimental that no speck of time is wasted. This album is Matt's sucker punch at society. Necroculture Vulture, Congratulations, and especially Full Metal Dipshit, all critiques of the modern world, and in Matt's eyes, it being the reason for the problems of the newer generation. This 16-track behemoth is truly Matt's magnum opus, and the true artistic representation of what Machine Girl stands for. A big fuck you to what they see as an oppressive system, And you could see Matt's musical progression as an artist, from his lively experimental beats from back in the day to the much more message-oriented, hardcore meaning behind Matt's present era of work. Sometimes the progression between Wolf Girl and where we're at now, it feels like there's been a direction or a mission. Because when I first started Machine Girl, it was definitely with the idea of becoming what it is now. It still hasn't totally reached what I imagined it to be years ago, but now because it's been years and my tastes have grown, there's less of an endpoint. It's just mutating endlessly. Over the course of this album's release, Matt was interviewed about how he feels about his work. In a musical sense, he says he's happy with it, and that it was what he was trying to make from the start. But in an overall sense, he still holds this pessimistic viewpoint. The ugly art doesn't feel like the end of something. It doesn't feel like I've achieved what I set out to do. With the newer shit we're writing, it feels more freeing, because it's not like I have a preconceived notion of what Machine Girl needs to be. And at the end of the day, no album has to have all these achievements to their name. That expectation is far too high, even for some of the most mainstream artists in the playing field. Even an album like T-Pab, one of the most widely respected albums that has spoken out about modern issues, can only yell so loud into the endless void of muffled ears. But just because nothing's changed doesn't mean the effort taken to walk the walk is entirely meaningless. It does matter, greatly in fact, that you're voicing your opinions about what you want to change. Not only about the world you live in, but the person that you want to be. In Matt's own words, I think a really important message for everyone is that we all have the power to change. And if you're not happy with who you are now, you're not always going to be that person. The ugly art feels like what I meant to make, and I'm happy about that. Amidst the positive reception the album received from fans, there was quite a vocal minority of people who came to express their qualms with the record. Fantano, being quite possibly the largest creator to speak about this, said the album seemed far too reminiscent of Death Grip's earlier work, and it becomes far too distracting for him at times.
I'm pretty excited for Machine Girl that this seems to be one of his most well-received projects so far. Like, there's a lot of hype behind this one, and I do appreciate some of the genres going into this record, the hip-hop, the digital hardcore, the noise, but I feel like a lot of the drums and a lot of the synths and the sampling as well, this record just seems so deeply inspired by Death Grips. Very deeply inspired. Like Jenny Death, Steroids, a little bit of Money Store here and there, I guess some No Love Deep Web, but yeah, it just seems deeply inspired by Death Grips to the point where it's a little distracting. Like, you could almost throw Ride on some of these songs and it would pretty much sound like a Death Grips track.
I'd say the comparison is fair enough. It's undeniable, given the fact that I discussed this previously, that Death Grips is a big influence on their modern format of music. And for him to be put off by that is totally fair. It's not going to be well received by every person. And this critique that Fantano had was also kept quite similar with U-Void's Synthesizer, the fifth official album released by Machine Girl. Fantano's main critiques of U-Void came down to several factors, with the record not being very memorable, and while he did enjoy the in-your-face aspect that Machine Girl always implements, he would have wanted their compositions and their ideas to be better presented. And while I do agree that U-Void was not Machine Girl's most polished record, I personally still enjoyed it. Matt did end up catching wind of this review from Fantano, and he pretty much said that while it does suck that he didn't get a positive score, he still appreciates that Fantano even took the time to give him recognition. And I'm not bringing all of this up to have this be Fantano versus Machine Girl, more so as a showcasing of opposing views. Not everyone will enjoy your record. It's inevitable. But what you can do is take the criticism and build upon the valuable critiques given. Machine Girl has always had this polarity between the cult following it has and the rest of the world that sees it. But whether or not you're able to take the things said and improve upon your work is another. And I'd say that Matt has done this extensively and fairly throughout his entire career. Machine Girl has had a heavy amount of influence in their decade-long music run. They've inspired the styles of many modern artists as they have been influenced by others themselves, and they'll keep doing so in the future for as long as they keep on creating. They've attracted an expanding, yet relatively cult following to their name, with people from all kinds of being. They got my attention while I was just beginning to expand my listening tastes, and they've stuck with me for quite some time. I think that albums like Wolf Girl and Because I'm Young will serve as checkpoints for future artists on the come-up. They're pleasantly abrasive in all the right places, and the overall experience draws my weird ear for music. I don't know how much longer Matt and Sean will create music for, but I do know one thing, and that's that their ideas will stick around in the long run. I don't always understand the intricacy of an artist's work, and I don't claim to. At the end of the day, it really is only my interpretation, supplemented with some of their words. I can't truly dive into Matt's psyche and see precisely what he wants to portray, and in reality, that's not what art is for. It's up to the person to try and interpret it for themselves. That's the beauty of music and art in general. It's in the eyes of the beholder. And somehow, through the intense amalgamation of multiple genres, Matt and Machine Girl as a whole have managed to create art out of chaos. Something that is almost impossible to do. So thank you, Matt. Thank you, Sean. And thank you, Machine Girl, for creating one of the most interesting musical experiences of my generation. Thanks for watching.